Second day, the Future of Finance Summit, the new format conference that we've put together and that we will be building on for the next few years as we define and redefine how the industry should evolve or take stock of how it is evolving and in a real and credible manner. I made some comments yesterday at the opening keynote. No use of the word, the F word. There are green bottles that you are welcome to find each other and just donate into it. And the reason we don't use the F word in this conference is not because technology is not central to a lot of the evolution that's taking place in the industry. The reason we don't use the F word is because we don't want you to use phrases without thinking about what it actually means. And worse than that, by taking it for granted that the person you're speaking to actually understands what you're saying. So very often we degenerate into cliches and phrases that makes presumptions about how we understand the industry and what's shaping it. And by removing that word, I'm also asking you to then replace it with words that are closer to what you want to say. So if you're raising funding, then you're raising funding. If you are introducing a disruption technology, then you're introducing something that's a disruption. And if you are just an IT vendor, a new age IT vendor, having developed something on Java, then that's all you've done. And so we will make a distinction between the boys and the men, between the leaders and those who run of the mill. We want to avoid what happened during the dot-com era, where everyone who thought that just because you are in dot-com, you are entitled to large amounts of funding, that your parents would think that you've got a career or a calling that is bigger than a job, and then it fizzles out in a few years. And perhaps most important of all, it never added to your understanding of how the industry is evolving into the future. Today, we have two components to the summit. We have the main tracks, of which this is one. We're also running something called Future Wealth, and it's a little seed that we are planting. The moderators for Future Wealth are not bankers, people who understood the industry as man on the street. That's what I meant. And the reason is that increasingly, this industry has to be understood in a personalized manner, in the same way that we understand ice that we pull out from the refrigerator, and we don't need to understand the business of the ice merchants. And there, all of the issues that we've been discussing from an industry perspective, blockchain or Bitcoin, managed investing versus index funds, robo-advisors, are all discussed from the customer's perspective looking back. And we need to be credible in the way in which we give customers a reason to believe in how we are leading the industry and not make it a suspicious backdoor for us to sell more and be more productized as we always have been. Because over time, through all of these technologies, the customer is going to be increasingly in charge of their personal investments and personal wealth. And we need to redefine ourselves in terms of how we want to be relevant to the universe in which we serve. And in this way, we are laying the groundwork for the summit to become a repository of knowledge and of learning that we can build on in the years to come, and it becomes a resource to the industry. Yesterday, we had a number of keynote speakers who helped us think through where legislation is today and how it's evolving, and what about current legislation is core to the evolution of the industry going forward. This morning, in this morning's keynote, through our keynote speakers, as well as through the panelists that we've invited from out-of-box thinking, Samsung Pay, PayPal, Grab, and so on, organizations that we never previously imagined were part of financial services or had any relevance to financial services, we want to understand just the answer to one question. That question is, what happens when the financial services industry finally loses its intermediation role? The world moves in phases, and in one thought leadership idea that I subscribe to, the world moved from a tribal phase to an institutionalized phase. And from an institutionalized phase, it moved to a markets phase. And now, from a markets phase, we are on the onset of moving into what is called the network phase. Tribal, we all understand. It's primordial, it's family, friends, people we are familiar with, village, and so on. And when we move to institutionalized phase, that's where many of you belong to. You've got jobs, you go in the morning to an institution, it's a predictable experience. You're brought together not because of your tribe, but because of your learning and because of your skills. And it's something that we understand today. I have a theory that the reason the financial services industry had these problems in moving from tribal to institutional is because that whole process was not narrated well. So if you take LIBOR, for example, and the crisis that ensued, LIBOR, you can argue, was developed in the tribal phase of European evolution of the financial services industry in the UK, where it was a gentleman's club. People were familiar with each other. When they institutionalized it, it had to have practices that had nothing to do with familiarity with each other. And then when it moved into the markets phase, I remember when the LIBOR crisis was erupting in 2010, I was constantly called by some of the international media because the announcements were made in London, and then the media needed to pick it up in the morning in Singapore and have it as a soundbite through the day when it reached back London in the next morning. And one question I was always asked was, so what happens to the responsibility that the LIBOR market had to the trading floor and $5 trillion in FX trading? And I said to them, actually, the problem was that LIBOR didn't owe a duty of care to the $5 trillion market. And I maintained that view for a long time. And if you know, finally, the UK courts were able to prosecute individual liability 7 years later to make that connection between an institution and the markets that trade on it. And as we know, markets go around looking for indices to trade on, of which LIBOR was only one of them. And increasingly, as we become more indexed, there will be other indices that the markets will look for. It can be indices of the value of durians. It could be indices of the value of coconuts, and so on. So it will get more and more ridiculous as we go along. But now we're moving into another phase, which is from markets to networks. And the big difference between markets and networks is that in the networks phase, there is no broker. So when we think about blockchain and all of the new technologies that are coming on in the network space, we are disintermediated from playing that central role. And for that reason, I'm a big critic of any financial services initiative on blockchain that keeps the bank in the center of the relationship. In fact, the validation comes from the fact that there is no center, that all of the parties interact with each other and validate each other in the process.